I'm talking about see how you doing on the settings?
Hi, Azeezah. In real life.
I'm talking about how to
Fantastic. Are the materials?
I'm surprised that 15 minutes.
All right.
I get to be last too. I get the tired audience.
Look at the vein, yeah.
Whoa, that's good. Oh, we have a glass actually, huh? Want some water?
Oh, yes, please.
We can fill up bladders up before we talk, right?
Oh, yeah, that's always a good strategy. Really quickly, right? Like, I would elaborate on this for another 15 minutes. So nature's equivalent of the music playing out at the Oscars.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you, everyone. This is the final panel of the No War 2018 conference in Toronto. And we'll start with a brief announcement from Bauman.
Oh. Boy, the power of colonization. It's just incredible, isn't it? What a... Yeah.
And I think the really insidious thing is the way that it's affected all of our systems of thought for resisting colonization itself, right? So that we're still relying on colonialization.
Hello, everyone. First, I would like to thank World Beyond War for such a beautiful and excellent conference. I think we all learned a lot from this. My name is Bahman Azad. I am the organizational secretary of the U.S. Peace Council and the coordinator of the Coalition Against U.S. Foreign Military Bases. You may have heard about the coalition's name. We were formed in 2017. 15 prominent peace and justice organizations around the U.S. came together and signed a unity statement that brought us together as a coalition to work against the foreign military bases that U.S. is holding in more than 800 countries, 80 countries, and more than 800 bases. So I am here to bring you the background to this and also invite you to a new one. This organization, this coalition, all of the 15 members are members of its coordinating committee. 5 of our coordinating committee members are already here. David Swanson, Leo Bolger, Ann Wright, Kevin Zeese, and Medea Benjamin. They are all part of the leadership of this organization. We held a conference in Baltimore, Maryland in January, which was an extremely successful conference. It was the first of its kind. And in that conference, a resolution was passed that we want to extend our activity into a global level and create a global campaign against US and NATO military bases. And the first act for this new global campaign, which has the signature of more than 50 organizations from around the world and signed by more than 600 others that have joined and signed its unity statement, is going to hold a conference against US NATO military bases in Dublin, Ireland, 16th to 18th of November of this year. we would like to invite you all to participate if you can. It's going to be a unique opportunity to bring all the forces together on the global scale against what is going on. And we have very prominent speakers. Dr. Aleida Guevara, daughter of Che Guevara, will be the keynote speaker from Cuba. We have Meredith Maguire. We have Adolfo Perez Esquives from Argentina. We have quite a number of members of the parliaments from Ireland and other places. The spokesperson for military affairs of Sinn Féin will be another keynote speaker. So we have a very high-level conference, and it's going to be very impactful around the world. And this is going to be just the beginning of a global campaign. We want to invite you to participate. If you cannot personally participate, please go to our website. I have handed out this flyer. Those of you who need it, let me know, and I'll give you a copy. nousnatobases.org. All the information is there for registration, for endorsing, for signing our unity statement and joining the global campaign. And also, if you cannot come, place an ad in our conference book or endorse the conference. And we all, of course, appreciate this is a very huge undertaking on our part. This is the first time we're doing this, and it takes a lot of resources and especially financial support. So I would like to encourage you, if you cannot participate directly, do your share by really contributing financially so that we can pull it off. It's a huge task, and we are working hard to make it a successful conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bahman. All right, a couple of housekeeping items before we all leave. Please return your evaluation forms and your name tag and lanyard. I will be passing around a box to return the forms, and I have a lot of blank copies if you haven't received a form. Yes, we'll be distributing them throughout the auditorium.
Yep.
Don't forget to sign the Declaration of Peace on the back. We haven't seen that. We need you. And these boxes are for the lanyards. Okay. A final announcement before we get started. White poppies are available for sale right here in the second row. Can you raise your hand? Yeah. So afterwards, if you'd like to buy one. For donation. All right. Thank you to everyone for joining us at No War 2018 this weekend. A big thanks to OCAD for hosting us, to Professor Peter Jones for coordinating the venue, to the countless volunteers who have helped with many, many logistical tasks such as making coffee all day long. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the conference sponsors, endorsers that tabled at the event, and to all of the speakers, and of course to all of you for attending. Thank you. As we conclude the event, our closing panel is titled Energizing the War Abolition Movement in Canada and Globally. This session will examine how we can use our knowledge and skill sets to take action to enact change and build a war abolition movement worldwide that is diverse, inclusive, and widespread. How can we grow the grassroots power of the anti-war movement by working in coalition with other groups, by making the interconnections between war and militarism and other issues facing our society and environment, from climate change to the refugee crisis to economic and racial inequality? What tactics can we use as a movement to be effective at enacting grassroots change? What are the stumbling blocks that our movement needs to address, and focus on to become more effective. We'll begin with 20-minute presentations from each of our speakers, and then we'll open up to Q&A. Our first speaker will be Yves Engler. Former Vice President of the Concordia Student Union, Yves Engler is a Montreal-based activist and author. He has published 7 books about Canadian foreign policy. Yves has been dubbed Canada's version of Noam Chomsky, one of the most important voices on the Canadian left, and, quote, part of that rare but growing group of social critics unafraid to confront Canada's self-satisfied myths. Please welcome Yves.
Thanks, Greta. Thanks, everyone. So I kind of, I'm not sure I'm going to answer this question directly. Kind of find it a little bit difficult to answer directly because I think that a lot of what's needed in terms of war abolition is what people were participating in today. So I think it's difficult to repeat. Let's do more of what was being done today. That's not a very good presentation.
Can you speak more on the mic?
They fixed the mic.
Is the mic? Am I speaking into the wrong mic?
No, it's someone's got to raise it for him.
Does that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
That'll be too high for you, and then I'll go lower.
So in terms of moving towards war abolition in Canada, I think that we have to start by having a proper assessment of Canada's role in the world and the Canadian military's role in the world. Canadians have the most positive self-portrayal of their country's role in the world of any country. Over 9 in 10 people think Canada's a force for good in the world. The nationalist myth is incredibly strong, including far into the left and peace organizations, whatnot. So we have to break down some of that nationalism, and we have to start not presuming the best of our military, of our foreign policy leaders, but presuming the worst, because the history suggests that Canada has, its foreign policy, its military policy has been about 2 things, primarily. Supporting empire, historically British, today American, advancing Canadian corporate interests abroad. That's overwhelmingly what drives Canadian foreign policy. And if we look at the history of Canadian militarism, what wars that Canada has participated in have been justified? When we sent 400 troops to help the British maintain control of Khartoum in 1884, 1885, was that morally justified? When we sent 7,000 troops to South Africa to help out Cecil Rhodes' mining interests and British imperial interests in South Africa, was that morally justified in the late 1800s? World War I, hundreds of thousands killed. What was that about? That was about advancing empire. The Korean War, what was that about? 27,000 Canadian troops, many naval vessels in a war that left millions of people dead. The first Iraq War, when we participated in that war, what was that about? That was about, re-solidifying American dominance in the Middle East. The bombing of former Yugoslavia, late 1990s, the illegal bombing, was that justified? Afghanistan, more recently, 40,000 Canadian troops, or Libya, 2011. Look at the state of Libya, look at the state of Afghanistan today. Any of those wars morally justifiable? And the answer is that in the history of Canadian warfare, there's only one war that could be argued that was morally justifiable, at least after the fact, which was World War II. That's not to say that what motivated Canada's participation, of course, was support for British Empire, not fighting fascism, not fighting anti-Semitism. It was support for British Empire, but you could argue after the fact that that was morally justifiable. Now, there is a whole tendency among progressive opinion in this country to criticize war from a very nationalistic perspective and from a perspective the world needs more Canada, right? We criticize our wars by saying we need our military to go elsewhere, to shift deployment. So this is Jack Layton in 2006, the former head of the New Democratic Party, saying, quote, "New Democrats have not written a blank check so that this government can drag Canada still farther into war, so that it can remove us farther from our role as international peacekeepers." So what's going on in Afghanistan is bad because we're not engaged in peacekeeping. Or here's Walter Dorn, who the Rideau Institute is one of the main people they work with, Walter Dorn, a big proponent of peacekeeping, referring to Afghanistan as well, saying, quote, "The first consequence of our current deployment in Afghanistan is that Canada is currently at a historical low in its UN peacekeeping contributions." I thought the first consequence of our war in Afghanistan was that we were occupying Afghanistan, not that we weren't able to be engaged in another moral crusade. And that gets to the whole question of peacekeeping. This idea that Canada is a force for good in the world, that we engage in peacekeeping, and that's what our troops have to be doing. So for instance, when Canadian peacekeepers helped in solidifying the coup against the elected government in Haiti in the mid-2000s, that was a peacekeeping mission that even someone like Walter Dorn from the Rideau Institute actually promoted, actually worked with in Haiti. Or take another case of Canadian, this peacekeeping that Jack Layton and Walter Dorn are proposing we engage in, the Congo in the early 1960s. Canadian peacekeepers were engaged, played an important role in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the independence leader in the Congo. Or even the Korean War, which was actually under a UN umbrella, and arguably it was a UN mission. So we need to be, we'd have to have a more honest assessment about what the Canadian military is doing around the world if we want to move towards abolition. We also have to have a more honest assessment of what a non-wartime means, right? Like right now, most of us think, or certainly most of the public thinks, that we're not at war. Canada's not currently at war. But we have about 540 troops on the border of Russia and Latvia heading up a NATO mission there. We have a couple hundred troops in the Ukraine supporting low-level war there. We have almost as many as 850 troops in Iraq today. We got refueling aircraft there. We got helicopters. Obviously, the special forces, Canadian special forces on the ground in Iraq, a couple hundred. We have our Canadian naval vessels patrolling provocative maneuvers off the coast in China, right, alongside our allies. Canadian naval vessels patrolling off the coast of Africa. There are indications, off the coast of Nigeria that's been about Nigeria's major oil reserves. So we have a very forward deployed military in a non-war time. And we have to be honest about this assessment. I don't think that certainly most of the Canadian public and probably even many anti-war activists are not really sort of following just the scope of Canada's military engagement. Also, of course, and I know people maybe earlier today touched on this, but we have a major arms industry in this country. Major arms industry, depending on over the years, 7th to 12th biggest in the world. Very recently, a recent report about Canada being the second biggest arms exporter in the Middle East after the U.S. So there's a major military apparatus. Department of National Defense is a major military apparatus, and then we have these a whole industry tied to it. Now, the scope of the Department of National Defense of the Canadian military is hard to get your head around. I was really taken aback by the scope of the Canadian military, just one component of the scope of the Canadian military, researching a book called The Propaganda System about why we're so confused about Canada's role in the world. And the Canadian military is the largest public relations operation, largest public relations machine in the country, right? There's somewhere as many as 600 full-time employees in the public relations of the Canadian military, promoting a pro-militarist, pro-Canadian military view of the world and of what they're doing. But it goes way beyond just the official public relations. They have their own history department with about 50 employees. They have their own university. The only federal government-run university is the Royal Military College, run by D&D. They have some of their own media. They fund war commemorations, tens of millions of dollars a year into war commemorations, into university programs. They have associated think tanks that engage in regular media endeavors, generally from a pro-war direction. Often the think tanks are funded by the Canadian different arms companies. So the balance.
We have 400 reserves without fresh water.
Exactly. So when we talk about the Canadian military's budget, over $20 billion, right? And this doesn't include, you know, Canadian Border Canadian Border Services, RCMP, Coast Guard, which is also billions more in terms of that would be more actual defense, something approaching closer to defense. When we talk about the budget of the Canadian military, when we talk about something like the naval procurement ship program that we're in process of building, it's $60 billion for new naval vessels that would be $100 billion over the life cycle. That is a lot of getting proper water to reserves. That's a lot of free education. That's a lot of daycare positions. But there's almost no one saying that, right? Across the political spectrum, from the Conservatives to the Liberals, NDP, to even the Green Party. The Green Party's got themselves totally tied in to militarism, even kind of unbelievably. I would suggest someone take a look at the amount of statements Elizabeth May has made calling for the end of the naval procurement shipbuilding program. I would say someone look around to find how many times she's criticized that, and I think you'll find it's either zero or very few. And so it's across the political spectrum. And the imbalance of resources. We talk about like building a movement to challenge militarism in this country. We have to properly assess just the incredible scope, the imbalance, right? We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of full-time people working for the military, engaged in some element of military PR, some element of basically promoting militarism. And on the other side, how many do we have full-time employees in the peace movement, right? You know, almost yeah, one. I think at one time the Canadian Peace Alliance had a full-time employee. You know, there's depending on exactly how you define it, but there's very few, right? So the imbalance is just over the top in terms of the resources. But there are positives, right? Despite this incredible imbalance, polls show that Canadians put a very low priority on the military, very low priority, consistently. They generally have a sort of positive, military is good, there's sort of a low-level positive, but if you ask them to spend money on the military, almost every other social program is above military spending. And that's a consistent pattern. So that's obviously very good, and that means that of course, that's the base that we have to work with, right? That's the base that we have. A lot of our work doesn't not that much to be done. We need to organize that kind of disparate opinion about the military spending. Now, I'm of the opinion, maybe different than some people here. I'm of the opinion that in fact, that anti-war movements and international solidarity movements have in fact constrained the Canadian military, if you like, civilized the Canadian military over the past decades. You actually, if you take a long-term view, you see some positives in terms of Canadian militarism. So for instance, if you look at the way that Canada fought maybe the Boer War in the late 1800s or the war in Korea, compared to the fighting in Libya or Afghanistan. Like I said, I totally opposed the war in Libya, Afghanistan, but it looked like, 5 minutes, it looked like we were bringing like daisies to the people of Libya and Afghanistan compared to what we did in Korea or South Africa, right? The brutality of what we were engaged in Korea in the early 1950s, or the concentration camps in South Africa. We hear about the Boers put in the concentration camps, but there's also tens of thousands of Africans that died in those camps. The brutality is much less, and I think that's actually because of the anti-war movements. From those promoting the Stockholm banned nuclear weapons in the early 1950s to against a huge amount of anti-communist kind of ideology going on at that time, to those who for years were handing out leaflets at Lytton Systems, somewhere in the suburbs of Toronto, against a cruise missile in the 1980s, to those rallying last weekend against at Chrystia Freeland, the foreign minister's office, against the war in Yemen, to those bringing court challenge against Canadian arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It exists, right? That the war abolition movement exists. It exists in this room or throughout the day, here, and it exists in very low levels with peace groups across the country that are mostly dormant. Unfortunately, Canadian Peace Alliance is nothing like it was in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. But there are still some organizations campaigning. And basically what we need to do is amplify that work. I don't think that it's a particularly complicated question. We know most of what needs to be done. We just need to do more of it, and we need a whole lot more people helping us do more of it. And so it's a matter of amplifying it. I don't think there's any magic wand or magic way of figuring all that out. I've put forward one thing called the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, and I have a sign-up sheet at the back outside that people can sign up for that, which can be an information clearinghouse on Canadian foreign policy. Just to end, to me, there's three fundamental points that we have to agree on in this country with regards to war abolition. One is significant reduction of the Canadian military budget. I've proposed 10% a year over 5 years, and then reevaluate. Another is too slow. Sure. Another is Canada out of NORAD, right? Through NORAD, we are complicit in basically any American military endeavor, taking any major American military operation through NORAD, right? That doesn't get a whole lot of discussion, but that's the reality. And of course, Canada has to pull out of NATO. And NATO puts this pressure.
NATO.
Canada out of NATO. Yeah. Which NATO puts. Sorry?
You have to redesign Canada as a peace model. You can't do it half and half. It's like you're going to change driving on one side of the road to the other. Well, first we'll just move the truck.
That's like, on that note, that's basically my conclusion. So again, substantial reductions in the Canadian military budget, Canada out of NORAD immediately, Canada out of NATO immediately. That's far from the a genuine peace, but those are some important baselines that anti-war movements, war abolition movements, I think should get behind. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yves. Now I'll introduce Azeezah Kanji. She is a legal academic and writer whose work focuses on issues related to racism, colonialism, and social justice. Azeezah is the Director of Programming at Noor Cultural Center, a Muslim educational, religious, and cultural institution right here in Toronto. The center's work is dedicated to advancing causes of gender, racial, decolonial, economic, environmental, and animal justice. What a comprehensive list. From the perspective of Islamic ethical and legal traditions. Azeezah is a regular speaker in community and academic circles, and her writing has appeared in the Toronto Star, National Post, Ottawa Citizen, Rabble, Roar, Open Democracy, ePolitics, and various other academic anthologies and journals. Welcome, Azeezah.
Anti-patriarchy begins with lowering the mic.
Not too low.
Thank you. It's a bit low. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Thank you, Greta, and all the other organizers of this conference. Thank you to my co-panelists, and thank you to all of you for continuing to do the hard work of rendering visible and resisting the systems of death, devastation, and injury that the colonial, military, industrial, think tank, media, entertainment, national security complex would rather remain invisible and therefore irresistible. I want to begin by greeting you all with words of peace. Assalamu alaikum, my sisters and brothers. At a time when so many words that have beautiful meanings for Muslims are popularly represented as slogans of violence. Allahu Akbar, which means God is greater and reminds us of the contingency and limited nature of human knowledge and will. Jihad, which means striving or effort, and which as Muslims we understand applies primarily to the struggle to control oneself and one's own harmful impulses. Inshallah, which means God willing, and reminds us that ultimately the fate of our world is not in our own faltering hands, but in the hands of God. At a time when so many words that have beautiful meanings for Muslims have been represented as slogans of violence, it is important for us to remember that as Muslims, we begin every interaction that we have with a wish for peace. Assalamu alaikum. Salam, peace, meaning so much more than simply just the absence of conflict, but rather the positive presence of justice and loving kindness. Words are so important. They shape and limit our understanding of the world, and therefore the possibilities of action that are open to us. So it is absolutely vital that we have an accurate linguistic framework for apprehending the forms of violence and injustice that we are confronting. And war, as heinous and despicable a word as that is still a euphemism for the forms of violence and oppression that are prevalent in the world today in the so-called war on terror and in other exercises of militarism. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Palestine, in Somalia, in Kashmir, in Myanmar, in China, and in so many other places that have been turned into theaters of brutalization. War, as heinous and despicable a word as that is still a euphemism for these modes of violence, which are more accurately described as exercises of colonial punishment against populations that have been expelled from the bounds of humanity. The distinction between war and colonial violence is fundamental and crucial for us as anti-war activists to understand. During the 19th and 20th centuries, as European states were developing the international laws of war that would apply to regulate and limit violence between themselves, they formulated these laws to deliberately exclude their colonies from many of the protections and restrictions they encoded. And so completely different sets of rules and logic were applied to war between civilized Europeans versus colonial relationships between those civilized Europeans and barbaric or savage non-Europeans. While war in the Eurocentric framework of international law was understood as a symmetrical conflict between parties considered equally human and equally sovereign, colonial violence was represented as an asymmetrical clash between human Europeans and subhuman non-Europeans, against whom colonial powers could use almost unlimited violence, forms of cruelty and torture that they had at least theoretically banned for use among themselves, while the use of violence in return by the colonized was deemed inherently illegitimate and a justification for further infliction of colonial domination. Colonial discourse inscribed on the world an abyssal line, in the words of eminent critical legal scholar Boaventura de Sousa Santos, a racial line separating those who are recognized as fully human from those whose humanity has been negated and who are therefore relegated to the realm of subhumanity or infrahumanity or non-humanity. On the human side of this line, Boaventura de Sousa Santos argues, interactions are structured by the logics of emancipation and regulation, while on the infrahuman side, the governing logics are appropriation and violence. This abyssal line between the human and the infrahuman runs through colonial legal history to the present. It connects the settler colonization of Turtle Island, the colonial and Holocaust genocides, to the enslavement and brutalization of Black people, to the projects of securitization and militarization against Muslims. In his book, The Muslims Are Coming, ! Professor Arun Kundnani describes a disturbing poster he saw in a Texas restaurant while traveling through the United States researching counterterrorism policy and its impacts on Muslim communities. The poster depicted a man in a turban being lynched, and the caption read, "Let's play cowboys and Iranians," graphically superimposing the anti-Black racism of lynching upon the anti-Indigenous racism of settler colonialism, upon the anti-Muslim racism of the war on terror. We need to understand that in the poster, as in life, these multiple discourses of violence are intimately intertwined, reinforcing and feeding each other to construct the specter of racially different threat, of people that need to be violently eliminated or subjugated or deported or surveilled in order for those who have arrogated to themselves the privilege of full humanity to feel that they are secure. The deep connections between the violence of settler colonialism against Indigenous peoples and the violence of the war on terror against Muslims and others who are racialized or mistaken as Muslims are evident in the nomenclature employed by the American military, in the use of Geronimo as a code name for Osama bin Laden in the mission to assassinate him, Geronimo being an Apache leader who resisted the incursion of US forces onto his territory, in the use of the term Indian country to describe so-called enemy territory in Afghanistan and Iraq. As Cornell law professor Aziz Rana has observed, the legal logic of the war on terror resurrects the very same legal arguments that were used to rationalize what are commonly referred to as the American Indian Wars, but are more accurately described as European colonial genocide. The representation of indigenous nations as savages incapable of adhering to international law, which to Europeans justified the suspension of the normal laws of war applying between supposedly civilized nations, i.e. themselves. This same logic of the savage is reincarnated in current arguments for the suspension or reinterpretation of the international laws of war in the war on terror, permitting more extensive use of state terror than is normally permissible against populations who have been stereotyped as terrorists, the present-day savages who have been expelled from the bounds of humanity. In fact, government lawyers at the Guantanamo Bay military commissions have explicitly cited precedents set during the so-called Indian Wars in their prosecutions of Gitmo prisoners. The execution of genocidal violence against indigenous peoples in the so-called New World from the 15th century onwards was itself shaped by Europeans' previous interactions with Jewish and Muslim communities in what they call the Old World, the dehumanization and demonization of which enabled exercises of extreme state repression and expulsion, such as the Spanish Inquisition. And so, while the proponents of the war on terror argue that this is a completely new type of conflict, justified by what is claimed to be the unprecedented nature of the threat posed by global Islamist terrorism. When we look at history, we see that the specific forms of violence deployed in the war on terror, preemptive invasions, use of torture, extended occupations motivated by resource appropriation, we see that these forms of violence are actually very old, and that the abyssal logic of dehumanization underpinning all of them has been built into the very foundations of the modern international system. Colonial projects have gone by many different aliases over the years: civilizing mission, humanitarian intervention, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, international policing, peacekeeping, winning hearts and minds, saving women, decolonization, liberation. But colonial violence by any other name is still colonial violence, and we see it for what it is. What are the implications of this for our struggles, you could say our jihad, right here, right now, to counter systems of militarism and colonial violence? First, it means that we cannot separate our opposition to Canadian and American militarism abroad from efforts to decolonize the terrain of Turtle Island that lies underneath our own feet. The border itself is a product and an instrument of colonial violence, and so we cannot allow it to circumscribe our analysis and our activism. Our resistance has to be as interconnected and as mutually supportive as the forms of injustice and violence that we are standing against. We know that the colonial legacy sustains itself through divide and conquer, by cutting apart what is connected so that we cannot see how our experiences and our struggles are related across difference, and how our seemingly separate presents are built from conjoined histories. Many Canadians have the privilege of not being directly confronted on a regular basis with the violent fruits of our militarized economy, producing the illusion that we, at least, already live in a world that is largely beyond war. So that, for example, Torontonians could feel resentful at proposals to cancel the annual air show to avoid triggering the PTSD of Syrian refugees, for whom military jets have been primarily experienced not as a source of entertainment as in the air show, but as a mechanism of state terror. The everyday illusion that we live in a world mostly beyond war in Canada obscures the harsh reality that Canada is not only deeply invested in military economies that sustain suffering around the world, as Yves has outlined so powerfully, and as I know Kevin will also, I'm sure, elucidate on, not to try and predict what he's going to say. This illusion not only obscures our implicatedness in military economies that sustain suffering abroad, but they also obscure the foundations of the Canadian itself, of the Canadian state itself, which are still situated on the ongoing violence of Indigenous genocide perpetrated through institutions of militarized policing. We need to I'm not going to stop you for clapping for me, so. We need to apprehend the structure of the whole in order to work at dismantling any part of it. Otherwise, we may end up inadvertently strengthening one aspect of the state's racializing and exclusionary structure while attempting to weaken another. For example, when as Muslim Canadians, we uncritically appeal to our rights as citizens to mitigate the abuses of national security without paying attention to the violences of Indigenous dispossession and migrant exclusion that are embedded in the very institution of citizenship. We should also be cautious and critical about the way that we employ arguments based on international law in our activism. Many of the fundamental concepts in international law, war, human rights, freedom, sovereignty, property, have been developed on Eurocentric colonial foundations and projected as universal through the epistemicide, the erasure of the worldviews of the colonized, of colonized people's understandings of what it means to be human, what it means to live in relationship with land and to each other, what it means to be just, what it means to be free. International law is a double-edged sword. It has functioned not only to protect people from certain forms of violence and abuse, but also to cloak colonial domination in a veil of legality, while displacing and destroying the traditions of knowledge of the colonized that are the grounds of truly critical anti-colonial resistance. We must be careful when appealing to international law to oppose particular instances of injustice, that we are not shoring up the walls of a structure of knowledge that was built precisely to imprison and dispossess those on the infrahuman side of the abyssal line. We often think that the mark of power is to be able to prevail in an argument or a debate, but the true function of power is the ability to set the terms by which the debate occurs. And when we are arguing on terms that have been constructed explicitly and implicitly on the presumed inferiority of the racialized other, then in an important way we have already lost more than we can afford to concede. In his recent book, Restating Orientalism, Columbia University professor of Islamic law, Wael Halak, distinguishes between dissenting voices and subversive voices. While dissenting voices challenge specific abuses within the framework of power as it exists, subversive voices challenge the framework itself and work to build one that is more just. And so let us all here work not only to dissent, but also to subvert the paradigms of violence, the structures of knowledge, law, language, and power that have made so much human and non-human suffering thinkable in the first place. We should remember that this land has been Turtle Island for far longer than it has been Canada, and from it we may imagine and build a world that is truly beyond war and colonial violence for all who live in it. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Azeezah. Our final panelist is Kevin Zeese. He is a member of World Beyond War's advisory board. Kevin is a public interest attorney who has worked for economic, racial, and environmental justice since graduating from George Washington Law School in 1980. He co-directs PopularResistance.org, which works to build the independent movement for transformational change. Kevin was an organizer of the occupation of Freedom Plaza in Washington, D.C. in 2011. Kevin is co-founder of Come Home America, which brings people from across different political spectrums together to work against war and militarism. Kevin has served on the steering committees of the Chelsea Manning Support Network, which advocated for the WikiLeaks whistleblower, as well as on the advisory board of the Courage Foundation, which supports Edward Snowden and other whistleblowers. Welcome, Kevin.
Okay, is this good height? I need a there we go. You can tighten it. Great. I learned from my first speech here to get the microphone right. Okay. Oh, wow, to be the last speaker. What an honor. What a really great couple of days. And thank you all for staying to the end. It's fantastic. And I really have been impressed by all the speakers and so many people in the audience, in the workshops. It's great to see people working on these issues. And I want to tell you that it's coming at a time, I'm so glad to see World Beyond War, Black Agenda for Peace, the No Bases Coalition, the long-term groups like Code Pink and UNAC and others, working to end war now, because we are coming into a period of history in the next decade that is going to be filled with challenges and opportunities. And we need to be well organized to take full advantage of those opportunities. And I think this is a conference that helps us get there. I'm not going to focus in my final talk on war or on militarism or on the law that relates to international. I'm going to focus instead on movements. What makes popular movements succeed, what challenges we face, and how we overcome them, and where we are as a social movement. And I do that because in these next 10 years, we need people to understand how movements work. We're not going to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that come from the challenges we face unless we understand how we win. And Margaret Flowers and I just completed a class on popular resistance at popularresistance.org school. That's 8 classes on social movements and how they win and the challenges we face. And I'll tell you that we've had now nonviolent resistance movements in a modern sense going back more than 100 years, back to the Gandhi was the late 1890s. And over that time period, we've got a lot of lessons about what works and what doesn't. And so we're not writing on a new slate here. We can learn from our past. We know what works and what doesn't work. I'll tell you what the ingredients are to a successful mass movement. Now, this is not like a cake, so it's not a guaranteed good cake. But if you put the ingredients in, you have a good chance of getting a cake out of it. First off, it needs to be a mass movement. And what I mean by that is fringe movements don't win. Mass movements win. And so we want to develop a movement that pulls a lot of different groups to get groups of people together, different types of people together. In fact, another ingredient is diversity. Diversity is important because you want people with different backgrounds, experiences, understandings, because movements need to be creative. To be successful, you just can't keep doing the same thing over and over again. You've got to have lots of different people involved who bring lots of different ideas involved. You know, we called Occupy a leaderless movement, but it really was a leaderful movement. People came forward with lots of ideas and really created energy and excitement and challenges that made it more difficult for the government to deal with. The third ingredient is we have to be working for something that there's a national consensus for. I'll talk about that a little bit more. We need to be, we're already building toward this on lots of issues. We see that at Popular Resistance, our organization, we cover the movement every day. Movement for economic, racial, environmental justice, and peace. We cover for that movement, and we see the movement building in so many different areas and national consensus developing on lots of different fronts of struggle. And so we're in a position to really take advantage of that, but national consensus is critical. Second, we need a mobilized minority. The good news is the minority can be tiny, single digits. Research over the last 100 years shows that if you have a movement working for the national consensus, they have always won when as little as 3.5% of the people are mobilized. They won with less, but they've always won with 3.5%. Never lost. Dictatorship, democracy, mobilized people working for something we've developed national consensus have always won, and that's where we're going to be going in the next decade. Second, we need to be resilient. Resilient because there are lots of challenges in movements. We often think that we're fighting and trying, and then small numbers of people show up at an event, and oh my gosh, we're losing. And it's easy to think you're losing. And that's why resilience is so important. We have to recognize that we are building a movement, and not every action has to be a big action. In fact, not every action is a resistance action. We need to actually cover multiple paths at once. We have to resist, and we have to build. We called it Stop the Machine, Create a New World when we were organizing the Occupy. Flexibility, resilience requires flexibility, requires varied tactics, different approaches, changing the paradigm, resilient to the stresses that come with building a movement. The most important thing to understand in developing a movement successfully is the grand strategy. The grand strategy is the test we use for almost every action we take. There are 3 parts to it. First off, growing the movement. As I said, mass movements win, fringe movements fail. We need to build the movement, get more and more people involved, so every action we take has to be designed with that purpose, and I'll get into that in more detail in a second, because how we build the movement matters as well. Second, we need to build unity and solidarity. People need to be part of a movement that has internal cohesion, where we all understand where we're trying to get to. And so that kind of solidarity, and we can then work with different fronts of struggle. As we saw in this conference, we heard about the militarism at home. We've heard about the racism at home. Yes, we have to stop wars abroad, but we have to also face the crisis in our own situation at home. And third, we have to have a deepening resolve. We have to have more and more confidence in our going forward, more and more confidence that we are on the right track. And I think that we are getting there on that point. When you develop your movement, it's important to think about what is holding the power structure in place. What we're in the middle of is the classic conflict of people power versus the people in power versus the power holders. What holds the power holders in power? One way to think about that is like a building with columns. All those columns that hold the building up, or in this case, pencils that hold this building up. The columns would be things like the security structure, the military and the police. That's part of the power structure. Workers, part of the power structure. Businesses, part of the power structure. Students, youth, media. In every campaign, there's a little bit different power structure. In fact, when you get together with your group organizing your campaign, you'll probably want to go through an exercise. Who is holding the power structure in place? When you figure that out, then you start to figure out how to build your movement, because one of the goals is not only to build our movement, but to weaken the power structure. And so when you're organizing an effort to grow your movement, you want to target parts of the power structure to pull parts of it to your side, to cause fractures in those columns. So those columns begin to get weaker, and the power structure gets weaker as well. So, you want to organize actions that are designed to bring youth in. You think about what our issue in the old days in Vietnam was easy. The draft would bring the youth in. That helped to build a massive movement. You want to think about what's going to bring labor in, what's going to bring business in, what's going to bring the security state in, or at least fracture the security state. I know in Occupy, when we were doing Occupy, we actually fractured the security state. And that helped Occupy to go and get stronger. They unified down the road, but in the beginning of the first few months of Occupy, we had police on our side. We had the Baltimore Police Union actually endorse the Occupy of Baltimore. We had, when Margaret and I would walk the perimeter of the Occupy at Washington, D.C., we talked to the police and hear about what their struggles are, because they're dealing with the same environment, high tuition for their kids, a mother who's not old enough to get Medicare in the United States, and no Canadians are better off, not old enough to get Medicare and can't afford her health care, not getting raises in their salaries because of the health care costs, and so unions are fighting for survival. The attacks on unions, the police were feeling all that too. And so we were able to form, not coalitions with police, we didn't do that, but we did fracture the power structure, so there were police on our side. We would protest at the Chamber of Commerce multiple times at the Chamber of Commerce. They were a great target. Multiple issues, because the Chamber of Commerce is the big corporate lobby firm in Washington, D.C. We go there and their security guy would get all upset about us being there. You go to the D.C. police and say, hey, can't you do something to arrest these people? And the police who we've been talking to in the evenings would say, well, when they do something illegal, maybe we'll consider it. But they were just out there protesting, so the police didn't take action. We go to banks, protest at banks, get the same kind of reaction there. And so, we'd violate laws, we'd commit civil resistance. That didn't always mean that we got arrested, because the police were getting fractured. It's important to fracture our position. So as we are building our mass movement, we are pulling people from the power structure into the movement. With the media, for example, one of the ways we pull the power structure into the movement is we create our own media. We create our own media, so we create our own narrative. So the political culture changes through our independent media, through our websites, through our social media, we start to create narrative. When we put out Occupy, we didn't actually put any press releases out to the mainstream media. We focused on independent media. We had on our website for Occupy Washington, D.C. a list of more than 50 independent media who promised to cover us. Now, what does that do for the media, the corporate media? It does for the corporate media that they get warned. This is going to be covered, and you'll look like you're hiding something if you don't cover it. This is going to be covered. If you're not honest about it, people will have the real information. Your credibility will go down. So the media had no choice but to cover us, because it was going to get out there. And so we have to train ourselves when it comes to media. Someone else said it earlier, we are the media. each of us can reach thousands of people through social media. We can target decision makers. We can target media outlets with our message, with our narrative. So we can be the media, and that is a way of fracturing the media and bringing them to our side, because credibility is a big problem for corporate media. It's a big problem. There are low levels of credibility, and if we fracture and build our own media, we fracture their media. So build our movement and fracture them at the same time. It's important to think also about, when you're building a movement, of campaigns. These are not just one-off protests, one-off marches, one-off rallies. These are campaigns. You plan, you go through a process of choosing your goal, creating your vision, and then figuring out who your allies are, assessing who your opponents are, and deciding how you can reach them by going through a review of the power structure and figuring out how you can, in this campaign. And campaigns build and build and build. And the advantage of a campaign is it's an opportunity to bring more people in every step of the way. You can keep building your movement. As you do things, people hear about you. And when you're doing these campaigns, these movement activities, remember the first goal of the strategic plan of the grand strategy is build the movement. So you want to do things in ways where people see you and say, they're right. I want to be part of that. They're fighting for justice. They're right. I want to be on part. You don't want to do things that repel them. You don't want to scare them away. You want to pull them to us. And that includes people in the power structure, remember. So every time you're out there, you're creating an image for the movement. You're trying to be a magnet to pull people to you. So your campaign is about pulling people to you. And then when you start to organize your campaign, one of the things you're going to do is what we call a spectrum of allies, where you look at your solid allies. These people are solidly with you here. These people are kind of neutral. These people are kind of opposed. And there's people all the way in between. And your goal in your campaign is to move people one step toward you. Move the neutrals to on your side. Move on your side to solidly on your side. And so you go through a process and gradually pulling people to the movement's perspective. That's part of building national consensus as well. And so you plan your campaign. Now, in our lecture, our 8 classes, the last class, if you want to develop a campaign, that's a great class to look at. We go through a bunch of different tools on how you develop campaigns, how you develop who your allies are, how you look at who your opponents are, how you chart out who you focus on. It's a lot of different tools out there for that. And I'm not going to go through them all here today, but to give you a sense that that is the goal, is to build that kind of thing. The second thing you want to do, another example of kind of action you want to take, is that you want to take actions that create a dilemma for the opposition, where no matter what they do, it's not good for them. They're going to lose. We had a campaign in New York trying to get freedom of speech at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. They closed it down at night when there were protests. They had a curfew. And so vets we knew wanted to be able to protest in the evenings as well. And so we organized with them a campaign to change that. One of the campaigns was to read the names of the dead on the Afghanistan war anniversary. Read the names of the dead, and just happen to go past the curfew. So there we are, reading the names of the dead, gong, flower, another dead, gong, flower, and it's past the curfew. And they're the police. What are they going to do? They're going to arrest a bunch of vets, read the names of the dead? Or are they going to let us violate the rule and the curfew? Police were in a difficult situation. We created a dilemma for them, and that helped to cause divisions, because the blue-collar cops, who wore the blue uniforms, they didn't want to arrest us. The white-collar cop had to do the arrest himself. The guy with the white shirt on had to go make the arrest and pull them over the blue-collar cop, because the blue-collars, so we division right there. And in the end, we won that campaign, by the way. Another thing I want to emphasize is, important in your tactics, is the power of art and music. We underestimate this so much. Art and music are powerful. When you have a small crowd, big art makes you look big. Big puppets, a big earth, big pentagon, whatever, just make big art. And what's great about big art is you can have an art build. Create more unity in your group. deeper connections in your group. Get together to build art. It's a beautiful thing. Get together to sing songs. Creates unity, powerful unity. So think about how you can create unity in your organizing of these kinds of efforts. I want to touch on violence versus nonviolence. This is a constant issue in movements. There's no question in my mind that it's very rare to imagine a time when violence would work. And maybe if you're in a civil war, maybe there's that we can talk about that's a kind of case. But the way to discuss violence versus nonviolence, in my view, is to talk about as effectiveness. Remember the grand strategy. Pull people to the movement. Get people to join. Create unity. Violence does not pull people to the movement. Violence repels people. Nonviolence pulls people together. We saw this very clearly in the early part of Occupy New York. In the first week, there was a protest. They were marching. A bunch of people got put behind an orange mesh under arrest by the police. They were being nonviolent, but then the police came over and pepper sprayed them in the face for absolutely no reason. And at that moment, there were like 6 people doing the media work, had their cameras out, getting that on camera. Fantastic. You are the media. We saw blue-collar cops say on camera, caught by our media, I can't believe you just did that. It was a white-collar cop who comes over and pepper sprays everybody for no reason. And the blue-collar, I can't believe you did that. That night, Lawrence O'Donnell had a long talk on a monologue about his father was a cop and the role of the police. And the Occupy movement grew amazingly thanks to that abusive use of violence and the nonviolence. Could you imagine if those people behind the orange mess were throwing batteries at the police or even cursing them? Then Lawrence O'Donnell, whose father was a cop, would say, those people deserved it. Instead, we're on camera all being good. We're just standing there protesting, chanting, and they go and he comes and pepper sprays them? Nonviolence work to create the Occupy movement would have failed if it had been violent. That moment, that nonviolent moment won it. So I think when you discuss violence and nonviolence, it's really important to talk about the issue of what works and go back to that grand strategy. Let me also say this other thing, that one thing is that they will try to divide us. People maybe heard of Stratfor. Stratfor is the corporate CIA. They do CIA work, and they work with the CIA too, but they do corporate CIA work. The director of Stratfor was very honest to say that the Ukrainian-U.S. coup was like one of the most obvious coups in U.S. history, even though most Americans don't realize it was a coup. But even Stratfor was a mad. But they put out a document that talked about how you defeat social movements. And they put us into 4 categories of activists: radicals, realists, opportunists, and idealists. And that's not a bad analysis. But their strategy was divide those 4 groups. So you take that's like we would do to the power structure. Let's go to labor. How do we get workers on our side? How do we get youth? They would go, how do we get the opportunists on our side? What can we give them? We give them access to the media. We give them money. We give them, how do we get the realists on our side? It's not realistic. Get what you can really get. How do we get the radicals on our side? We don't. We isolate them. And that's the key. We've got to create our own unity. Let me close by saying we are confronting in this front of struggle the center of racism, economic injustice, environmental injustice, and militarism. We are facing the centerpiece of it all. We're facing it at a time in these next 10 years when many crises are coming to a head. So it's so important for us to be doing what we're doing, so important for us to be understanding what we're doing, and to be in a position that's really, as moments come up, and there will be moments of opportunity, sometimes a threatened attack, sometimes a torture moment, sometimes a positive example of peace. We've got to be in a position to know what we're doing to create the kind of mass movement that can win this effort. It is achievable. We can do it, and don't let them tell us we can't. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Kevin, Azeezah, and Yves. All right, now we're going to open for Q&A. We have about 20 minutes for questions from the audience. So we'll have Mary Ellen and Liz come up to be the mic runners. right, questions? Raise your hand. Any from this side?
Kevin, how do you deal with provocateurs?
Oh my gosh. We actually have a whole hour on that. Infiltrators and provocateurs are the normal course of business, and there are ways to deal with it. Well, the one first key thing is recognize that infiltrators happen, but there are people who are mentally disturbed sometimes look like infiltrators. So don't make accusations unless you can prove it. With provocateurs, I think if you have a suspicion that someone's an infiltrator or provocateur, I would recommend interviewing that person almost like you'd interview, just like, not in a threatening way, but welcome to the movement. What brought you here? What are you interested in? What are your skills? Where do you live? Get their information so you can start to figure out, is this person legitimate? If the person seems like a provocateur type, it's very smart to have people around them who you trust. So that if they do something to cause a violent act, you have people there to control it as best you can. And so I think once you realize you have this problem and you start to confront it in a thoughtful way, there are ways to minimize it, but sometimes you can't control it. And the level of infiltrators is gigantic. We've done research on this. Typically, in most movements, you find 1 out of 6 people in the movement are infiltrators or informants. 1 out of 6. They came out after 1968, the Democratic Convention. About 5 years later, after freedom of information, they found 1 out of 6 of the protesters were federal agents, not even counting Chicago. 1 out of 6 were federal. I was Ralph Nader's spokesperson in 2004, and our vice president was Peter Camejo. He ran for president against Jimmy Carter in 1976 as a socialist, and his office was broken into over and over again. They sued the FBI in court, so does the FBI. They got the FBI in court, which is amazing. I don't think most judges even allow that. They got the FBI in court. The judge asked the special agent in charge of the FBI, how many people do you have working in the Camejo campaign? Camejo had about 200 people working in his campaign. It was like 66. 1 out of 6 of the people working in his campaign were FBI agents, including the campaign co-chairman. So it does happen. It's a reality, but we can deal with it. We have a special class just on that because it's such a serious problem.
Thanks, Kevin. Next question from this side.
Yeah.
John?
Kevin, again, I'm familiar with the number that between 2.5% and 3% of a population actively engaged is all you need to succeed. But you use the word, as long as you have national consensus. Now, there's never a consensus in the classical word in anything. And my big concern with the anti-war is the huge number of people that are just so pro-war and believe that the military is the key to our security. So what define national consensus?
She put the time up sign up and I had to stop. So I'm glad you asked that question. National consensus is a key. And if you study our class, there's 8 stages of social movements. The 4th stage is the blast off, the takeoff. That's like the Occupy moment. The 5th stage is the landing, where, oh my God, it disappeared, nothing happened. The 6th stage, which is what we're in right now, is called majority times. You enter that stage with majority support like we do on wealth divide, on lots of issues, healthcare, on many issues we are, including war, by the way. And the goal from majority times is to go from majority times to supermajority support, which would be national consensus. National consensus means answering these 3 questions. First, is there a problem? Yes, people agree. Okay, there's definitely a problem with war. Expensive, it's destructive. Second, will the status quo solve the problem? I think we got consensus on that too. The status quo is not going to solve the problem. And then the third one, that's the key one, will you look at alternatives to the status quo? And that's where we have to make our case. I do think that, I don't know, I heard some Canadian statistics earlier, I think you mentioned them, about some opposition to war or militarism at a low priority. In the United States, President Obama won against Hillary Clinton because he didn't vote for the Iraq War. Just because he wasn't in office. He was lucky he was not in office. He could say he was against it. But Hillary voted for it. So he was the anti-war president. He ran as idiot wars like Iraq he talked about. President Trump, he won because he promised make America great. Let's not get involved in these foreign entanglements. Now, both have been foreign entanglement presidents, both have been war presidents, but they won because they took those positions. People want that. Now, I'm not saying that the other side, the people in power, have a lot of control of the media. And so when they want to build up to a war, they can put the propaganda out. They can fool us. Now, we have to be positioned to handle that. That's one of a lot of our classes are about how we handle those kind of things. But so the national consensus can change, but that's the goal, those three questions. And you ask those questions consistently throughout the movement. Is there a problem? Will the current situation solve it? Are you open to solutions? And then you have to answer, and that works with every issue. I mean, you can, and no matter what issue you're working on, you go to an audience and ask those questions. I saw this first with Kurt Schmoke when I was working on ending the drug war. Kurt Schmoke was the mayor of Baltimore. He'd go to these conservative black churches, talking to conservative black women in churches who are all worried about drug use, and he'd say, is the drug war working? Will more drug war work? Are you open to some real solutions? And he pulled them in. That works with every issue.
Question from this side?
My name is Mitchell Gold. I'm here. My last stop was at the Hague Appeal for Peace, and I see a number of friends here from the Hague Appeal for Peace, and I have comments for each of you, but I want to just be short because I'm struck if we're going to create a movement here, we could do it, but we must get away from what you're saying, Kevin, and that's not a nationalist movement. It's a global movement. If we look at it from a nationalist perspective, it's shooting ourselves in the foot. We need to look at how we reorganize the United Nations. The Secretary General has already started it. He just did it the wrong way. We have to know what he did and then change what he did. Many here don't even know the United Nations has a resident coordinator. You know, I don't know if you know that, but there is a position called United Nations Resident Coordinator. I won't challenge you on knowing it. The Secretary General recognized it after me being on his doorstep for 5 years. They decided to change it, but they're doing it the wrong way.
Do you have a question for the panelists?
The question is, what will it take this organization and this movement to challenge the United Nations Resident Coordinator and get me fired? I took the position in Canada because it doesn't exist here, and I'd like everyone here to write a letter to Prime Minister, get me fired. I don't want the job, and will you help me?
You want to comment?
We will help to get you fired. That is our guarantee to you. I think the problem is actually deeper than just the way that the United Nations is organized, but has to do with the very fact that our entire international system is built around the institution of the nation state, which we know is a colonial structure of political organization that was imposed through civilizing missions. And in fact, the goal of restructuring all of these different political systems along the lines of the nation state was a primary justification used for the civilizing mission in the first place. And so built into international law, we have this bias in favor of legitimizing state violence with this conception that the state is the sole user of legitimate violence, which fundamentally skews our analysis of things like terrorism, so that, for example, we focus on groups like Al-Qaeda and we don't focus on the United States unless the state happens to be a Muslim state like Iran, and then in that case we say they're state sponsors of terrorism. But so there are deeper structures of bias that are built deeply into the very way our international system is organized, which then translate into some of the malfunctions with the United Nations, but it transcends the particular problem with the United Nations. And so I think it's vital that we not only act at a global level, i.e. non-nationalistically, but also work at a subnational level to support indigenous structures of sovereignty and law that aren't tied to the nation state system. And so to work to actively subvert this idea that the world should be organized along nation states that have militaries and armies and that they're the legitimate users of violence.
Question from this side?
Hi, my name's Adrian Harper from a little community near Vancouver. Just a very quick question for Kevin. You spoke of that 8-part program. Is that available somewhere for download?
Yeah, you can look at it. So our website's popularresistance.org. On the top of the page, one of the choices is school, and it's a series of classes, and they're all on YouTube and available. They're eight 1-hour classes. Margaret and I are running them, and they include slides and photos and all sorts of fun stuff. So
Great.
Check it out.
Question on the other side?
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much. Can I ask 2 small questions to Yves and Kevin? Sorry, Azeezah. She's my sister, so I can ask her.
Yeah.
I can probably ask her at home. Although I think I've heard enough from her. Anyway, that's besides the point. Yves, I think you said in your remarks that war has become less brutal. And so this is a genuine question. I know sometimes when we ask questions, it's like actually a pointed comment as a question, but this is a genuine question, which is that has war actually become less brutal, or have we become better at sanitizing war or making, or removing, separating the brutality from the actual brutalization, or it's just a little bit cleaner? So that's my question for you. And then Kevin, I know you were talking about how we require mass appeal for our movements. And I'm sure you're an excellent organizer and much better than me. I've never convinced anyone of anything. So this question...
Not even her own sister.
Yeah. So, I mean, this question is about that, but I wonder how possible it is to create mass appeal when we, without compromising certain values and ethics, because from my understanding, injustice is so effective because even the people most dispossessed by injustice are still invested in its perpetuation. That is this mass, we've all been sold, the poor people have been sold on Trump, right? Just as an example. And so I imagine that we're more likely to create mass discomfort if we're actually challenging the very paradigms that we're trying to unsettle. So I wonder how you kind of engage with that.
Yeah, I mean, a simple way would be to quantify. So during the Korean War of 1950 to 53, as many as 4 million people were killed. They stopped bombing North Korea when they figured out that all buildings of more than 2 stories had already been destroyed. You know, what happened in Libya is, incredibly violent, and probably tens of thousands of people have been killed over the past 7 years. I don't know about how many exactly directly during the 6 or 7 month NATO bombing, but nothing even close. You know, that if you take some reports of napalming of villages in North Korea, that there's this one that I talk about, Lester Pearson, who was Canada's foreign minister at the time. It's actually reported on the New York Times. The whole village was wiped out, and people were dead, except for apparently one older woman, and the bodies were decomposing because they'd just been hit by napalm. And Pearson complains about why this got past the censor. He's like, well, maybe this has to happen, but how did this get past the censor? Or even just take that, right? Take how the military controls information. During World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, there was either formal censorship, or in the case of Korea, sort of formal censorship in the theater. That doesn't, the way the Canadian military tries to control information during Afghanistan or Libya recently, they have very elaborate forms of information control, but they don't have formal censorship. And I think that, that's partly tied to breaking down of hierarchies. I think we're more internationalist and less racist today than we were 50, 100 years ago. I think quite clearly. That's, again, not to say that what Canadian troops are doing in the world today is in any way positive, but we've constrained them, right? And I think it's important to realize, there's some people like ceasefire.ca, which is an anti-war group that does a fair bit of good stuff, that people in this room might support some of their stuff, and I support lots of their stuff. But in my most recent book, I talk about a statement they put out where they refer to Libya Libya and Afghanistan as more controversial wars than Korea or World War I. Like, that's unbelievable that the left-wing group would do that. Like, how could World War I and Korea not be totally controversial? They were like clearly horrible things. But we buy the mythology. Even the left, to a large extent, promotes the mythology of this pre-positive time. And I believe that why the important point of saying, not this, making the point that the military fights in a way that's less violent today, is not to say that as a pro-military thing, but to say that that comes out of activism. We've never won. I don't think the anti-war movements haven't really ever won, the arguable exception of 2003 in Iraq, where we won the main thing the Bush administration wanted, which was Canada being a formal member of the coalition, the will. And we still provided, Canada still provided all kinds of very aggressive support to the American military, including a Canadian general that headed up 35,000 troops in Iraq. So we haven't won the big picture. We're not in a position of winning, but we've been in a position of changing the political culture, constraining the military's ability to operate. And I think we need to applaud ourselves for those never victories, but having a consequence on the direction of things, because it means something in terms of people's lives. So.
Kevin?
We believe, as far as compromise goes, our view is we need the ICU strategy. I don't mean intensive care. I mean independent, clear, and uncompromising. We need to be clear on what we want, and we need to be uncompromising that demand. Now, that doesn't mean that every suggestion by the people in power is going to be unacceptable, but we have to be very critical of the compromises. For example, in the United States, we have the Affordable Care Act. Many people thought that was a great compromise from single-payer health care. It wasn't. It was a bailout of the insurance industry, a total rip-off. We were fooled. And people need to say, no, we want a national improved Medicare for all. And so I think compromise is very dangerous. I think our job is to be clear in what we want and pull people toward it. Our job is not to compromise with people in power and let them protect what they want. We have to take power from them.
Last question from this side.
Azeezah, I thought your talk was so exhilarating and crucially important for us, because I think the way you tied together, like the war against the Indians, with the lynching of blacks, with the with the war against the Muslims, and saw how this is all part of a power structure that we're all sort of a part of. Even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Kellogg-Briand, these are still that come out of that colonial mentality that we're all kind of heirs to. And then you suggested a whole new world of connections with the Muslim world, with indigenous world, and so on. And I guess my key question is, as we move forward, how can we get out of just being who we are, get out of our skin, and join in a massive collaboration with the kind of groups you're talking about, and really build a world beyond war in a power that brings together these incredible diversity of groups?
Should I answer, or do we want to take the rest of the questions?
That's the last question we have.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much for your question, and I'm sorry you won't be able. I know there's some desperate hands waving.
Tool of the anti-war movement. It is not a tool of colonialists. Me and my colleagues have acted for many, many people from many countries, upholding their freedoms to liberty, to life, to freedom from torture. We've never had one single person say, leave us alone. Those are not our values. Those are not our freedoms. However, we have had countries, the people who are trying to kill them and imprison them, say, those are not our values. Those values have been imposed on us. So I just want to give a shout out for international human rights.
Clarify, I think that's the most crucial document for building world law. But I just wanted to say that we have to rethink the way we're looking at the world.
Mm-hmm. So I think those are certainly very important ways that international law and international human rights law in particular have been used, and those are the uses indeed that we see most publicized by organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. We see those successes in part because they are easy to publicize, and we can identify discrete examples of instances where human rights law has been successful. What is more difficult to examine, and this has actually been the work of a group of dedicated legal scholars who organized under the umbrella of third world approaches to international law, legal scholars from the global south and racialized communities, looking at some of the more insidious instrument effects that adoption of an international legal framework, sometimes at the expense of other modes of organizing, have had on movements for justice against colonialism. For example, Balakrishna Rajagopal, the author of International Law from Below, argues that adoption of an international law framework, while important in achieving opposition to specific forms of state harm, has also institutionalized notions of property, for example, which we know directly trample over indigenous conceptions of relationship to land. And so I think those are some of the deeper effects of adoption of an international law framework that we have to be concerned about. Similarly, critical scholars point out that there is this fundamental tension in international human rights law, in that while the state is represented as a primary source of violence against populations, it's also represented as the source for redressing those violence. In other words, it takes state power for granted, and it perpetuates an international mode of thinking in which we think that the nation state is the way that political power should be organized, which, as indigenous scholars like Taeke Alfred and Glenn Coulthard point out, are actually displacing other ways of thinking about what it means to live in relationship with each other and in relationship with land. So I think those are some of the things we need to be aware of. When it comes to where do we go from here? I think, so it's easy to say things that we are against, right? And things that we obviously should oppose. We should obviously be opposing the Canada-Saudi arms deal. We should obviously be opposing the increase in Canadian military budget. Sometimes it's more difficult to say positively what our ideal outcome would be, because so much of what is presented as alternatives are still circumscribed within the same colonial logic. So, for example, military intervention and humanitarian aid are often represented as being alternative approaches to intervention, but when we look at the way that so much humanitarian aid has actually played out, because it is still located in a colonial framework premised on the inferior sovereignty and development of the people who we're claiming to be aiding, we see that it's actually functioned to enrich the aiders far more than the people who are supposedly being aided. The problem is that when you're in a paradigm and all your points of reference are within that paradigm, it's difficult to see its limitations and its violences and its constraints. And so I think it's very important that we work in solidarity with indigenous peoples who are resurrecting indigenous paradigms of what it means to be political, with Muslim scholars who are going back to the Islamic legal tradition and recovering other ways of understanding what it means to live with each other in justice and to organize the relationship between law and territory and community. I think it's absolutely vital that we recover these other paradigms of knowledge so that we are better able to appreciate the contingency and the limitations and the violences of our current ways of doing things, which are too often taken for granted and too often taken as the entire realm of possibilities that we have from which to act. And that's not easy, it's not immediate, but I think long term, that's the only way that we can recover a world that is pluriversal, a world that has room for all of us to live in without the violences of war and colonialism.
Thank you, Azeezah. Thank you to all of our panelists, Yves, Kevin, and Azeezah, and thank you to everyone. That concludes No War 2018.
And a big thank you.
Nice.
A big thank you.
You're awesome. Don't forget to hand in your lanyards and your evaluation forms.
Hang on.